400 miles above Earth, there is no sound, no weather, and no margin for error. In September 2021, a single spacecraft, the Crew Dragon Resilience, orbited at this altitude, entirely alone. The mission tested whether a crew of civilians could launch into a vacuum, operate a spacecraft for 3 days, and survive the trip home. They could, and they did. The crew lifted off from Kennedy Space Center's Launch Complex 39A, spent 71 hours circling the planet, and successfully splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean. The hazard of this specific flight lay in its isolation. For the first time, a human spacecraft launched without a professional government commander on board to step in if something went wrong. The mission, named Inspiration 4, was built around 4 philanthropic pillars represented by its crew. Commander Jared Isaacman funded the flight. Medical Officer Hayley Arceneaux represented hope. Mission Specialist Chris Sembroski represented generosity, and Mission Pilot Dr. Sian Proctor represented prosperity. Dr. Proctor is a geoscientist, a science communicator, and an artist. While she is a trained pilot, flying an autonomous spacecraft requires a vastly different skill set than traditional aviation. There was no NASA personnel sitting beside them to manage the hardware. Furthermore, the flight plan did not include a rendezvous with the International Space Station. If a critical system failed, they could not simply dock with a larger, safer structure. They were entirely dependent on themselves to survive a lethal environment. Normally, that open nose cone houses a complex docking adapter, explicitly designed to latch onto the International Space Station. But Inspiration 4 was a free-flying mission. With no station to visit, that docking hardware was dead weight. Instead, engineers removed the docking mechanism and installed this custom 3-layer plexiglass observation dome known as a cupola. The cupola provided a view, but it also functioned as a physical limit, a glass barrier sealing the crew inside without a path for docking or rescue. Preparing a civilian crew for this reality required condensing years of standard astronaut training into roughly 6 months. That training began with strapping into a massive centrifuge to endure the severe G-forces required to break Earth's gravity. To test their psychological resilience, the crew spent time trekking up the side of Mount Rainier. The hostile, high-altitude environment forced them to manage stress, communicate, and solve problems as an isolated unit. Inside the SpaceX simulator, they memorized every feature of the capsule. They rehearsed system overrides, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. The Crew Dragon is highly autonomous, but if the software failed, these 4 civilians had to know exactly how to stabilize the vehicle on their own. On September 15, 2021, the Falcon 9 ignited in the dark. The rocket tore through the atmosphere, exhausted its first stage, separated, and pushed the Resilience capsule into orbit. They did not stop at the International Space Station's altitude of 400 kilometers. Inspiration 4 kept climbing, eventually circularizing its orbit at roughly 585 kilometers above the Earth. At this height, the highest any human had flown since 1999, the view captured the entire curvature of the planet against the deep black of space. The altitude also exposed them to elevated radiation levels. As part of the Space Omics and Medical Atlas initiative, the crew collected their own blood, saliva, and skin biopsies, tracking how microgravity impacted their bodies. They were gathering high-quality medical data in real time. By the end of their 3 days, they had provided a baseline for how ordinary human biology reacts to deep orbital conditions. Coming home required shedding that massive orbital velocity. As the capsule slammed back into the atmosphere, friction compressed the air in front of it, generating superheated plasma and subjecting the crew to intense deceleration. Once they cleared the thermal barrier, the spacecraft deployed a series of drogue and main parachutes, rapidly braking their descent toward the water. Resilience splashed down safely in the Atlantic Ocean. Within an hour, recovery teams had hoisted the scorched capsule onto the deck of the Go Searcher vessel and extracted the crew. The successful return confirmed that autonomous aerospace engineering had reached a point where it could carry an unguided civilian crew through the lethal extremes of launch and re-entry. The mission raised over $240 million for pediatric cancer research at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, meeting its primary humanitarian goal. However, surviving a 3-day orbit does not immediately make spaceflight a standard commercial airline trip. The physical risks remain absolute. The hardware is incredibly expensive, and survival requires perfect execution. What Inspiration 4 provided was a functional baseline. It laid the groundwork for the Polaris Dawn program and subsequent missions pushing even further from Earth. Inspiration 4 did not democratize space overnight, but it removed the historical restrictions on who is allowed to cross into the final frontier.